probably 2,500 years until today, in the history of Western thought and philosophy, there is a kind of dispute, arguments, dichotomies, جدلية, okay, whether to follow Plato's approach to things or that of Aristotle, simply because both have two different and discrete ways of looking at things, okay, around them. In fact, even the ideas of literary criticism or their opinions of literature, poetry, emerge from this kind of thinking for both men, okay? Although Aristotle is Plato's pupil, but he has a different way, okay, of looking at things. So it would be it would be easier to us to understand the difference between two and even Aristotle's ideas if we understand the difference between their ways or disparate ways of thinking. Fine. In simple terms, okay, the idea is a distinction between depending on rationality or empiricism. اوكي معلش للمصطلحات لكن هلا بوضحهم. rationality اللي هي الطريقة العقلانية والempirical way الطريقة الحسية. يعني definitely you can answer now that Plato is rational, that he depends on thinking and philosophizing things in order to arrive at truth and reality. Okay, he always talks about the notions, the ideal world, talks about a way of thinking in order to reach the reality or the knowledge that he is seeking for. This approach is quite different from that in Aristotle's, let's say, paradigm or منهجه. Okay, which is empirical. الامبيريكال اللي هي الظاهرة الحسية. Fine. أعطيكم example. If I am Plato now, I can tell that there are cars on that street, sorry. Simply because my thinking would tell me, or my rationality will tell me that if there is a street, definitely there are cars, okay? But for Aristotle, unless he sees and he has experienced, okay, seeing or خلينا نقول sensing the sounds or the sight of cars, he would claim that there are no cars there. So while Plato talked about rationality, okay, Aristotle talked about the essence of something, that every object in life has its own essence. وهي المصطلح اللي استخدمه هو, which means that in order to know anything we need to have a first-hand experience of it rather than talking about it or just having preconceptions about it. We need to see it, to experiment with it. هلا في العالم الغربي وممكن عندنا هون أيضا we have two approaches for research based on the two realities, that of Plato and that of Aristotle. اللي بنسميها أحيانا scientific approach or rational approach, whether to just sit on your desk and keep thinking and producing ideas based on connecting whatever we call previous ideas to other, transcending in life, etc. Aristotle would look at things and in a sense, let's say, touches them. مش literally speaking, classify things, work with things, okay, so that knowledge can be produced in that manner. Fine. So this is their different ways of thinking. Now, another difference between the two is what we call, هلا راح أرجع ليش this introduction is important, because in answering the questions that Plato has raised, Aristotle would follow or would use a rather different, let's say, approach. Number two is the socio-political context. Okay, the socio-political context. And the socio-political context يعني is important, which تتذكر واحنا لما حكينا عن بليتو, he was concerned about the future of Athens. He wanted to يعني establish his ideal republic, while the conditions or the socio-political conditions have or had خلينا نقول بالماضي altogether changed at Aristotle times. The future of Athens was decided. There are no revolutions, no problems. So he has to consider the questions that Plato raised very calmly and, let's say, in a more, let's say, less fearful manner. Fine. Now, let's move on to the points, okay, that we are going to discuss today. خليني أعملكم share للفايل هذا. Okay, the one that will help you, okay, just tracking, يعني have an eye tracking of what I am explaining. Just a minute. يعني أنا عملته هلأ الصبح. Okay, this one, okay, just a kind of summary points to help us or to help you and me actually tracing the ideas in a chronological manner. Fine. So here we have Aristotle. Okay, you see my screen. Can you see it now? شايفين الشاشة? Just give me confirmation, please. Can
Yes,
you see my
doctor.
Yes,
screen?
the clear.
Mum-
Yes.
So, okay, first of all, we'll answer, take the points one by one here. Plato formulated the problems. What do you mean by that? إنه the four perspectives that Plato followed or used in order to judge and to give or provide his opinions of poetry are good ones. In a sense, they are the problems that any critic would see. Is there any art? Are there any rules, okay, for writing poetry or writing literature? Are there any means, or it's just a kind of inspiration? هلا القضية إنه Plato formed the questions, but he answered them according to his philosophy. Fine. But Aristotle, and this is for his genius, that he used the same formulations, but he used his scientific approach, okay, to provide full answers for these things. That's why his book, Poetics, يعني تخيلوا واحد بيكتب من 2500 سنة قبل يمكن شهر كنت أقرأ في بحث جديد، البحث 2020 يعني منشور، عم بستخدم Aristotle's Poetics, his opinions. That's why we'll say at the end of the lecture that Aristotle laid the foundations of modern criticism. يعني هو أسس النقد الأدبي، هذا أرسطوطل. Okay, so he provided those answers more fully, more calmly, and more even convincingly. And I leave it to you to judge whether to accept his or his يعني teacher's opinions. But first, I should warn you that in literary criticism, there is no stability of answers. يعني you will be troubled not only between Aristotle and Plato, but throughout this course, simply because it is a kind of a paradigm shift. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, again antithesis, etc. هاي اللي يسموها البارادايم. أشرح لكم إياها بدقيقة. يعني a theory emerges in a sense that, okay, cluster of ideas prove themselves to be right, and this is called a theory. It works for 10 years, 20 years, a decade, etc., until people or critics start asking questions about this theory or that. Okay, and if the questions accumulate to a degree that the theory cannot stand up answering them, okay, the theory collapses. And the answers to these questions produce a new theory. And this new theory goes for some time, okay, and the new generation of critics come and ask questions, okay, until the next, okay, this theory falls apart again, and so on and so forth. So this is the nature of literary criticism. اسمه literary criticism هو تفكير ناقد. All the time, all times, okay, asking questions, feeling speculations about things that we are discussing in this sense, okay? So the idea in here that you طبعا هلا يعني I can't use Plato to for example to read or to read a text, or sometimes okay people will say okay why Plato. هلا حنشوف هذا الأمر أكثر وضوحا when we see that people start يعني when we leave names into theories. هلا the first phase of this course would be just names. يعني هلا بليتو، أرسطوطل، هوريس، مثلا وودزورث، كولرج، etc. ثم بعد ذلك راح ننتقل ل schools of thinking. ما راح نكتفي بالنيمز فقط لوحدهم. fine. So the idea is that okay, literary criticism is evolving, is a kind of evolutionary task all the time, in flux, in moving, in shifting, rather than in being static in a certain manner. Fine. So Plato formulated the questions, and Aristotle answered them. We talked about the socio-political conditions. I won't repeat them. And also I talked about the scientific versus a philosophical approach, that both followed or used, okay, two different approaches in that manner. And also in his poetics لما يكون الكلام مكتوب بخط مائل اعرفوا this is a name of a book or a source, has approached poetry without any preconceptions, just to investigate, to examine the things the way they are, rather than talking about them, looking at them, and discovering them. So Aristotle answered the following details, or let's go into details to see how he answered things. First of all, imitation. الimitation حيبقى معنا. طبعا أنا نبهتكم بداية الimitation is equal to representation, depiction, portrayal. يعني any piece of writing about literature, or a critical piece of writing about literature, or any text would use these terms. اوكي لكن هلا احنا ما بنستخدم imitation. بنقول مثلا الرايتر represented مثلا اوكي البوت represented or depicted, because it's a kind of representation، يعني عملية تمثيل لشيء واقعي، imaginative work. زمان كانوا يستخدموا هذا المصطلح اللي بنسميه احنا الimitation او سمي الimitation. fine. Just to connect things together. Okay, Plato claimed that imitation is what? Is dangerous. Fine. And it undermines reality. ذكروا كيف انه حكى انه an inferior imitating an inferior producing an inferior offspring. هاي النظرة اللي كان يتكلم عنها. Aristotle disagreed with him, and he said that imitation is, let's say, an intuitive, inherent، لا inherent أفضل من intuitive، inherent, okay, characteristics of a human being. And he said it يعني explicitly, man is an imitative animal, okay, that we all imitate in our lives, and we learn through imitation. okay, كيف يعني we imitate؟ هلا any process that we do in life, starting from our, let's say, early years, we imitate our parents, we imitate the way they speak, we imitate the way they look at things, okay, and then we learn. So imitation is a source of learning. So it is not that dangerous thing about okay making things. يعني الابن لما يقلد ابوه النسخة المقلدة ما بتطلع سيئة بالضرورة. اوكي الفكرة عارفين كيف؟ يعني we imitate and we add to our imitation. we learn through imitation. And هلا انتو you are my students. In a sense, you are imitating my ideas. Fine. But definitely some of you will exceed your teacher. Okay. This is the idea. This is Aristotle ideas. Okay. And more importantly, as far as poetry is concerned or literature is concerned, now people take pleasure in imitation. And I need here to define the term pleasure. Pleasure does not mean يعني recreation or sometimes imitating sadness, okay, is a pleasure. But here you read a poem once, twice, three times. You hear okay, a music or listen to a song many times. Okay, at each time there's a kind of pleasure in what has been imitated. Okay, fine. يعني whether the song is sad or funny or happy or whatever its mood is, there is a kind of pleasure in that imitated word. Okay. هلا once we talk about imitation in a sense that it arouses a certain sentiments or features, this is directly to the point. That's what literature does throughout ages. Okay. Now احنا هلا يعني once we pick a book, text, a novel, a poem to read, we read it يعني انسونا من الجامعة والدراسة, لكن we read it for a pleasure. Fine, to see things, other perspectives of life. Fine. أهم من ذلك أيضا Aristotle's imitation different perspectives. Okay, هاي نقطة مهمة جدا. تتذكروا when Plato condemned or imitation as a thrice, in fact, or reality is three times removed from the object that we imitate. يعني an ideal world, concrete world, and then we have the imitated concrete world. Okay? Plato would say no, Aristotle would say no, it does not happen this way. Imitation, because the imitation comes not through the concrete objects, it's an imitation of the idea of the universal. يعني هلا خلينا ناخذ مثال حتى نفهم النقطة هاي. لو قلنا مثلا على رأي بليتو, the ideal notion of bed is that يعني abstract one existing in the ideal world and could be reached only through rationality. And once this notion is translated into concrete objects, it removes its reality once, okay? And if this is imitated by poetry, it's twice removed, I mean the reality. Here Aristotle says no, poets have different perspectives in a sense that they do not imitate the concrete world as it is, but they imitate universal ideas, ideal things. يعني هم بيقفزوا على العالم المثالي وبيعملوا له representations. أنا I do agree with this point. يعني هلا الشاعر ما بيمسك قلم أمامه وبيقلد القلم هذا, بيقلد فكرة القلم. القلم أصدق إنباء من الكتب. Okay, الإيجل أو حتى any notions in life. So once you read those realities, you discover that poets do not imitate specific objects, but they imitate universal objects. That's why we read and enjoy مثلا Russian, German, Indian, English, African writings. يعني هلا لو بغض النظر عن اللغة, لو نقرأ يعني أو حتى العمل المترجم, خلينا نتكلم, مهما كان مصدره نستمتع فيه احنا بطريقة ما, simply because this is universal. This is يعني a notion that is general in life. Can you see this point? Okay, yes or no? Mhm.
Yes.
Yes. ولا لو سألتك السؤال هذا، خليني دائما أنا يعني أزيد عليك الأسئلة. Can you distinguish between Plato's and Aristotle's approaches of imitation? How both looked at imitation. شو الفرق
Uh,
بين؟ أتفضل يلا.
yes, so Plato thought or said that imitation is dangerous because it will remove the reality once and twice and thrice sometimes because it's an imitation for the imitation itself. But Aristotle said that it's not this things are not going this way because in poetry we're not imitating a certain object or a certain thing, but we're imitating a universal one, just like the example you gave about the pen or pencil. I don't know. We're
Okay.
not like imitating a certain pen that no one knows about, but it's the idea about a pen that writes or something like this.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes, that's that. Okay. Now look at how the knowledge started to accumulate in Aristotle, because he يعني did not arrive at the closed ends. يعني each idea opens further ideas for him. That's why he started to distinguish between poetry and history. Okay. And he wrote a lot about this, in fact. Now, he mentioned or said that history talks about what had happened. Okay. يعني دائما التاريخ بيسرد الوقائع اللي ذهبت، اللي انتهت. يعني لو كان هومير مؤرخ وليس شاعر، كان يوصف من منظور تاريخي اللي هو Trojan War for example. But as a poet, okay, he depicts, okay, uh, or imitates what had happened according to the laws of probability and possibility. What had happened and what could or may happen. وركزوا على النقطة هاي. And this is why, again, we still read the classic works, okay? على الرغم من أنا against them يعني from other perspectives, but okay, you can enjoy those ideas. لما كنا نقرأ في الكلاسيك poetry أو الكلاسيك literature، إذا بتتذكروا اللي درسوها معي أو مع زملائي، there's a sense in there simply because يعني it does not only depict the past, but it exceeds or goes beyond, okay, and to expect what happens of the human sentiments. And that's why poetry remains more, in fact, rather than history or factual things. So the conclusion, and I'm quoting him here, that Aristotle arrived is that rather than merely imitating things in nature as Plato, okay, Plato, okay, said, okay, he actually attained to the ideal. بمعنى آخر, الpoet does not imitate things the way they are in nature, specific concrete things, but looks at the ideal things in nature and imitate them. Fine. So from a metaphysical perspective, imitation is a good thing rather than dangerous thing for Plato. Fine. Mhm. Okay. لاحظوا كمان هون. Therefore, imitation أو depiction أو representation، كل هاي الأسماء مترادفة. Okay. Of things not the way they are, but also the way they should be. Simply because writers and poets will imitate يعني good ideas, perfect ideas. And he said that imitation, هذا Aristotle, is only dangerous or bad if the poet lacks the ability to imitate well. يعني لما يكون عنده قدرة الريبرزنتيشن أو عندها قدرة الريبرزنتيشن مالها سيئة. أوكي. طيب في نقطة هون أنا مش كاتبها بس حابب أتكلم عنها في الإيميتيشن أيضا، يمكن تيجي تحت إنه ذات البيرسبكتيفز. تتذكروا when Plato asked Ion, okay, that poets provide information about مثلا chariot racing, about any crafts, without having any rules for these. People should go to, okay, craftsmen more than, okay, to poets. Here again, Aristotle looked at this idea and answered it very simply, saying that it's a perspective. وهي كلمة مهمة جدا. البرسبكتيف يعني ال concern of the poets is different from that of the for example carpenters. يعني بمعنى آخر، لو أجى واحد نجار بده يوصف الطاولة ويعطينا خصائصها الفيزيائية ويعلمها للابرنتس عنده أو إلى آخره، بنقول أوكي he has more knowledge about that وإحنا we trust that knowledge. لكن لو أجى الشاعر بده يتكلم عن الطاولة، ما راح ياخذها من نفس المنظور اللي أخذها منه النجار، راح يتكلم عن معاني أخرى. وإذا تتذكروا قصيدة الإيجل أو الوينتر أو حتى الأوبجكتس أوف لايف، يعني ألفريد لورد تينيسون talked about the eagle. He clasped the hands in crooked hands close to the sun in the lonely lands. Okay, إذا هو another perspective, and this does not mean that they provide false knowledge about the objects that they imitate, but those imitated ideas are different, or rather different from the things that, okay, we use in our real life. Fine. Now we move to some ideas, okay, away from Plato اللي هما التراجيدي. هلا بليتو أرسطوطل, okay, major contribution to literary criticism is his focus on tragedy. And يعني he studied it, let's say, carefully, and he provided a standing definition of tragedy. حنرجع له للكتاب نقرأه، لكن أنا جبت منه بعض الأشياء. It's an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude through a language that is embellished and causes a purification of feelings and sentiments. That's the full definition of a tragedy. And we need now to dismantle, نفكك this definition in order to understand it and what he means by tragedy. As we said, he studied, Aristotle studied okay, Aristotle studied, let's say, literature very much like studying biology, specimen. طبعا هو عنده كتاب بالأحياء. شو عمل بكتابه الأحياء؟ he um, he let's say classified, okay, اللي بنسميهم احنا animals, birds, reptiles, etc. according to certain characteristics. He came to what? He came to literature and did the same. So he talked about iambic, about the epics, tragedies, comedies, etc. But because he liked Sophocles a lot, he focused on what? He focused on tragedy. And he provided a full study of tragedy. Fine, starting from the idea of imitation. And he said that it is an imitation of an action that is serious in life. And it is different from the real life, that this imitation should be complete. In a sense, it has a beginning and end, a middle, a progression, and end as well. يعني دائما التراجيدي في الحياة العادية يعني مخربطة بمعنى آخر, because this is reality. While in natural life it should be okay. While in natural life it should be what? It should be, let's say, sorry, while it is, and I'm disturbed by the phone, خليني بس أعمل له هذا. It should be complete. And he used Sophocles as well. He's fan of Sophocles and analyzed his tragedies, and accordingly he built on his theories. Okay, and this is what new critics, or let's say contemporary critics, do, rather than okay just thinking and having preconceptions about the work and thinking about them. He took a first-hand experience of that thing, okay, in a sense that he is, let's say, mm, took the work and analyze it, and then start to provide theories about that. So, limitation of why it is serious. It is not يعني بمعنى آخر خطير, something that concerns people. A tragedy, something that is or deals with high matters in life. Okay, أعطوني بس دقيقة شوي بالله ثانية. Okay, guys. So those actions, okay, necessarily needed to be serious, okay, and they needed to be a form of ideas or actions that do concern the public and people. لاحظوا هنا. And also it had to be what? Complete. You can't imagine someone picking a tragedy or think of any tragedy and read it and let's say stopped at a particular or certain point and it's left open. There should be a kind of completeness in that sense. And let me say here that this Aristotelian sense or definition of a tragedy was followed, okay, throughout ages. يعني especially in the Renaissance age, which is the golden age of drama. The Elizabethan Renaissance age. Christopher Marlowe's, William Shakespeare, etc. They were just using that. طبعا هنا الكتاب راح يقول لكم انه it is not Aristotle's fault that his ideas were turned out to be rules. يعني حنشوف هوريس كيف حولها لقواعد. ثم الرينيسانس critics also moved them to be like rules in order to what? To create this act of what we call the criteria of writing the tragedy. Fine. Now, once talking about a tragedy, okay, definitely there must be something else, which is comedy. إذا بتلاحظوا هون أنا I didn't write any single word for comedy, simply because Aristotle dismissed comedy in one or two words. It was not of his concern, okay, because he thought of comedies as an imitation of a trivial, okay, matters of life, and it is directed to less important matters of life, and that's all he mentioned. But he returned to tragedy and provided full answers to the tragedy. Accordingly, he talked about the tragic hero. يعني in tragedies, the most important thing is what? Is the tragic hero. And for tragic heroes, he defined him as a following: a man who is not eminently good and just, yet whose misfortune is brought about not by vice or depravity, but by some error and frailty. And this is another definition, exactly his words, okay, of a tragic hero. So let's again discuss this definition. Definition of depiction of the characters in the part of the poet or the يعني احنا زمان كانوا هم شعراء اللي يكتبوا المسرحيات، يعني خلينا نقول البويت اللي هم هلا مفهومنا البلاي رايترز. اوكي. Need to get in the inner side or the inner self of their characters, to study them carefully, to understand their sentiments fully, and then to what? To answer them. It's a kind of purgation سماها of feelings، وعملية تهذيب لهذه المشاعر اللي يمر فيها الكاركترز. ما بيقدموا الأدباء أو الشعراء الكاركترز randomly passionately. It's not a kind of مثل ما حكى Plato just arouses the passion away from rationality. No, it's understanding of a human condition. It is an understanding of the human sentiments in its perfect manner. Okay, understanding in its perfect manner. Accordingly, بكل بساطة هذا بيعطينا conclusion. What's that conclusion? إنه الpoet is not a madman, is not an inspired man, is not an obsessed man. He has tools, okay, thinking tools, okay, in order to study their characters, to gifted people in the way they needed to what? To represent them in the best possible way. يعني هلا لما تقرأوا الريبرزنتيشنز، خلينا نسقطها على أعمال تعرفوها، مثلا في هاملت. هل تعتقدوا انه اللي ويليام شكسبير كان obsessed ولا was sitting and thinking carefully about each of his characters, whether we agree or disagree with his depictions, but this is a different story. يعني هذا بنسميه احنا political criticism. لكن according to the forms and the mastery of depiction, الform, it does not it does not it requires rational thinking. A person who is not obsessed, a person who is not mad, but a person who is gifted. So for Aristotle, okay, the poet is not a mad man, he is a gifted man who able to enter the nature of his character's suffering and feel their distress and anger before he can imitate them. There is a job. Okay, هاي البيداغوجيكال اللي تكلمنا عنها. There are ways, but these يعني هون حكى gifted man. Is it just the gift؟ وهاي القضية الجيفت versus learning the rules حنجيها أيضا في مدارس نقدية أخرى. Now, for all of these ideas in the part of Aristotle, okay, he reached conclusions in terms of, let's say, الethical والmoral. ما تكلم عنها كثير لأنه definitely he, rather than saying okay poets should be prevented or not allowed, he encouraged them. But he said that poetry is not يعني mainly a source of teaching. People would not يعني look at poetry as something that to teach, but also he said it's okay to have them in the society and to learn from them. Fine. So in a nutshell, all of these ideas can work against, or let's say answering his teacher's views. Okay. Uh, let's now. لا ما راح يكون معي وقت 8 minutes. I need you now, okay, to take the role حتى تريحوني شوي. Okay, I will ask you certain questions in order to rehearse, no more than that. فقط. Who can explain this point? Plato formulated the problems, Aristotle provided answers. Who'd like to, okay, talk about this point? يلا أنا سنتنس، خلينا نمر عليهم سريعا قبل ما ينتهي الوقت. Yes please. Okay guys. Yes. ليش ما بتحبوا تشاركوا انتم؟ تفضل. مين
So
معي؟ أحمد.
Plato
يس تفضل.
provided the questions, and Aristotle, through his scientific let's say rational thinking, provided the answers that needed to be addressed.
Okay. هذا perspective. Thank you Ahmed. From another perspective we can say that knowledge does not come from vacuum. Okay, it's always built upon previous knowledge. يعني هلا لما نكتب اي بحث ولا نعمل اي فكره نبني على افكار السابقين. Thank you very much يا احمد. Okay, what about the socio-political conditions of Aristotle and those of Plato? Yes. Do they affect the way both provided their views? شو حكينا عن Athens? What was happening during Plato's times and now during Aristotle's? Yes. بدكم تكونوا منتبهين إنه السوسيو political conditions, الworldliness of the let's say of literature is extremely important. It is affected by the conditions, social conditions. الأشياء الاجتماعية والسياسية تكون دائرة في البلد تأثر على الإنتاج الأدبي وحتى الأفكار النقدية. فقلنا إنه at Plato's time it was a kind of let's say problematic in terms of the revolutions, the political disturbance, etc. But it's now all decided in Plato's or Aristotle's times. Okay. طيب هلا الأهم من ذلك scientific versus philosophical approach. Who can explain the difference between the two approaches? Okay. Guys, what's the difference between scientific versus philosophical approach?
I think that Aristotle said that knowledge comes from sensual uh, things, like sensing things, more than sitting and thinking rationally about how things are going in life.
Yes, thank you ولا. Yes, احنا بنستخدم مصطلحات اللي هو using اللي هو rationality versus what empiricism. الامبريكال knowledge حتى الآن في عندنا بيسموه البحث التطبيقي. شو يعني التطبيقي؟ اللي هو based on empirical first hand data. اوكي طيب. Who can talk about imitation? What's the difference in imitation between both? Imitation between both. How both arrived at the ideas of imitation. بهمني أرسطوطل الآن. How are they different? Yes. آخر نقطة يلا راح نرجع له بالقراءة المحاضرة القادمة إن شاء الله الأسبوع القادم. كنت بودي إنه ننتهي منه حتى ما يكون فاصل زمني اليوم بس وقتنا. أوكي. Yes أحمد. How is تفضل. Can you answer this? How is Aristotle's imitation or perspectives of imitation or opinion about imitation different from that of Plato?
Well, in Plato's case, while he knows that man is an imperfect creature, so the imitation of the sublime reality will downgrade it from once, twice, or thrice. On the other hand, Aristotle knew that man in his own nature is an imitative creature, and on imitation he learns and experiences new things and takes let's say stances and knowledge from this imitation. So imitation is not a bad thing for Aristotle.
Okay, this is one point. Okay, another point is the manner of imitation, what is being imitated. وهذا مهم جدا for both. For Plato, okay, what is imitated is the concrete world, specific objects. But for Aristotle, it is universal. Okay, it is the imitation of the ideal, which makes imitation يعني a good thing rather than minimizing or undermining reality okay, in Plato's opinions. طيب guys، هلا ان شاء الله المحاضرة القادمة راح نرجع للافكار مرة ثانية في التكست اللي مكتوب حتى نتأكد ان فهمنا ارسطوطل منيح، ونكمل ما بعد ذلك. Thank you for coming and see you إن شاء الله next week. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
إن شاء الله، يعطيك العافية دكتور.
الله يعافيك، في أمان الله. السلام عليكم.